I don't know if it's enough. The U.S. crisis may come in terms of state governments, because a lot of the state governments, such as California, are in very bad fiscal shape. And then the question is whether the central government is going to end up bailing them out, which is going to be a further burden on the U.S. government.
It's heard the California state government is broken up.
The biggest problem is with the unfunded pension liabilities. That's the biggest problem. In terms of dollars, that and the health care obligations sort of dwarf the rest of it. So at some point, they just may not be able to afford to maintain these contractual agreements they have with labor and labor unions. And then the question is what's going to happen when they say they don't have the money? And then the question is the U.S. government going to pay for things? But it's not just California. Illinois is probably in worse shape. But there are a number of... it varies a lot across the states. Some states have been much more fiscally sound than others. It really varies a lot.
So how do you describe the Chinese economy, the current situation?
I would think that China should become less focused on exports as the mechanism for growth. Needs to concentrate more on domestic expenditures, particularly consumption. I would expect the household sectors to become more empowered in terms of ownership and to be increasing the share of GDP that goes to consumption. A lot of that should show up in imports. So I would expect the current account balance to move toward more of a balance rather than this very large set of surpluses. I don't know why China wants to hold all these international reserves that have very low returns in the form of U.S. government bonds and similar things. It's a very bad deal for China. So there are a number of other economic issues. Now, if you take it from the China perspective, and if you accept the idea that this was a good deal for the United States, then it says that it's not such a good deal for China. China's giving away too much of its domestic product too cheaply. If China would have a real appreciation of its currency, a further real appreciation compared to what it had done sometime in the past, well, it looks like you'd be getting more foreign goods per unit of goods that you give up, more foreign goods in the form of imports, and that would be good for Chinese standard of living. So it looks like, in reverse, China would be better off then with a higher, with an appreciated real exchange rate.
But the difficulty is that the export depends on the value of RMB. No. So maybe when the RMB is appreciation, right, the difficulties come.
Yeah, I think the first thing is exports depend on the economic well-being of the U.S. and Europe and other countries. So if those countries are in recession, that's going to have an impact on negatively on Chinese exports. Secondly, as you say, I mean, if the currency appreciates in real terms, then Chinese goods will become more expensive, and that would tend to reduce the demand. But frankly, I think it's been true for a long time that China's been selling lots of quality goods at exceptionally low prices. And that's been a great deal for the U.S. and other importers. Because the whole idea is not to export stuff, it's to have people improve their welfare, standards of living, and that involves consumption in the long run. And it's not like imports are bad and exports are good. I think that's sort of an old-time mercantilist mentality that is not really the right approach. So I think it's going to be the case that over the long run, the real exchange rate for China is going to appreciate. And as a related matter, exports aren't going to grow as they have been, and the current account is probably going to be more balanced. That's what I would expect. Of course, the United States has also never failed to give advice to China, although China has been doing much better than the United States for a long time in terms of economic growth, and in particular in reaction to the ongoing financial crisis and recession. So two of the key issues in terms of this advice from the U.S. are about the exchange rate and the Chinese current account surplus. So these two issues, I think, are in fact quite connected, and proposals you make on one are probably related to proposals you'll make with respect to the other. As a background, I think it's fair to say that China has a high real exchange rate compared to, say, the United States, meaning that one gets a lot of Chinese goods per unit of U.S. good in terms of making these transactions involving exports and imports. So the import of Chinese goods to the United States and Europe has been a very favorable deal for the recipients because we've gotten a lot in terms of quality imports, which have sustained, in particular, consumption levels to be quite high. This has clearly been a good deal for the United States and for Western Europe. Nevertheless, the United States has mostly complained about this situation. To see how strange this is, you could ask, what if you went to the extreme and China gave goods to the United States for free, which would mean that the real exchange rate was even much higher? It's hard to have a sensible economic logic where it's bad from the point of view of the U.S. if China gives away its goods for free. And basically, to some extent, it's been doing that by having comparatively low prices on the goods that it ships to the U.S.
For next year, the Central Bank of China will turn the monetary policy from flexible to stable, And so, do you think it's a good idea?
I think the monetary policy is fighting an impossible battle if you insist on maintaining the exchange rate. I think that's the central thing that has to go. Then one would expect interest rates in China to not be so different from those in the U.S., particularly when China develops further, so approaches the level of economic prosperity of the United States. But I don't think it's a feasible battle to be maintaining the exchange rate and at the same time trying to use monetary policy to do other things.
So do you have any suggestions, if you can, for the Chinese government how to solve the problem we are facing?
Well, I think there should be an increasing focus on consumption as a driver of economic growth because the saving rate is so high. So some of that, I think, involves more privatization so that there's more ownership of industry by the private sector and ultimately by households. And I think that automatically would tend to increase consumption, reduce the saving rate. So I think that that's one element that I would consider. So if I were advising China, I would advocate a series of policies related to these observations I just made. So part of that would be not to rely so much on exports, but to move more toward especially domestic consumption as a component of aggregate demand. And of course, domestic investment works in a similar way. But both of those also work toward reducing the current account surplus, which would mean that over time, China would not have increasing reserves, or maybe would be even reducing the level of its international reserves. It's kind of annoying that the U.S. is always trying to tell China what to do on economics in general and the exchange rate in particular. But I think it is the right policy, the right course for China to make the exchange rate more flexible. And I'm pretty sure that means that the currency will appreciate in real terms relative to the dollar and other currencies. And I think that should be embraced by China as a positive development. It's really a symptom of the fact that China has done so well in terms of economic growth. China's been doing much better, and as I've remarked somewhere before, I think China is in some respects the most capitalistic country on earth now. It's certainly not the United States. And I particularly got that impression once when I gave a talk at the university in Chengdu, and in the center of the campus there was a big statue of Adam Smith. And I could never imagine any U.S. university, such like Harvard, as having a statue of Adam Smith. That wouldn't be popular at all. So the fact that it seemed to be popular, at least in one location in China, I think supported my view about this country having shifted its attitude toward markets and capitalism. So thank you. Those are the remarks that I have.